Right now, as you watch this, nearly 300 hectares of the most expensive real estate in British Columbia, a jagged emerald stretch of the Sunshine Coast, is physically detaching from the North American continent and sliding into the Pacific Ocean. This is not a slow geological crawl that can be measured over lifetimes. It is a catastrophe happening in real time, accelerating with a violence that has blindsided every model. Data from the RadarSat constellation mission, processed by Natural Resources Canada, has confirmed a terrifying reality. The ground beneath the luxury estates of Southview Heights is moving 80 times faster than it was just 3 years ago. In some sectors of this crumbling coastline, the earth is displacing by up to 10 centimeters every single week. To walk these streets today is to witness the physical dissolution of a community. Roads that were paved months ago now resemble fractured glaciers, with asphalt backing into 2-meter-high ridges. Gravity is winning a war that the provincial government is losing. For 21 months, 135 multi-million-dollar homes have sat in a silent, freezing limbo after FortisBC was forced to sever natural gas lines to prevent a catastrophic explosion. Another 245 households lost electricity last August after BC Hydro issued a 24-hour ultimatum informing residents that the shifting soil had made the grid a lethal fire risk. There was no time for a phased withdrawal. Families who had spent decades building their lives overlooking the Salish Sea were given a single day to gather what they could before the lights went out forever. The Premier has declared a formal provincial state of emergency, and the local municipality has already burned through $64.4 million Canadian dollars in a desperate, failing effort to dewater the slopes and stabilize the slide. But the geology is indifferent to the budget. What was recorded as a manageable 120-hectare slide complex in 2022 has doubled in size, now swallowing more than 280 hectares, nearly 700 acres, and it is still expanding into neighborhoods that were deemed safe only months ago. Yet, the most chilling detail is the institutional abandonment. When local authorities petitioned Public Safety Canada for $38 million in disaster recovery funding through the disaster financial assistance arrangements, the federal government denied the claim twice. The reasoning provided by federal auditors was cold and final. The landslide is classified as a pre-existing condition. The federal government looked at the collapsing cliffs, the buckled highways, and the hundreds of Canadians living in the dark, and ruled that because the earth had been moving for centuries, its sudden, violent acceleration did not qualify as a new disaster. This has created a terminal financial trap. Standard Canadian homeowners insurance policies specifically exclude earth movement, a catch-all term that covers landslides, subsidence, and erosion. There is no bailout coming, no insurance payout to be had, and no escape for these residents except for a voluntary provincial buyout program offering 75 cents on the dollar based on 2022 appraisals, before the ground began to scream. To comprehend how a mountainside overlooking the Salish Sea, just 40 kilometers northwest of Vancouver, can simply liquefy and retreat, you have to look 15,000 years into the past, back to the retreat of the Fraser Glaciation. As the massive ice sheets withdrew, they depressed the continent, allowing the sea to flood what is now the Sunshine Coast. This process deposited deep layers of weak, sensitive glacial-marine clay, the geological failure plain known to local engineers as the Seashells Shear Zone. When sea levels stabilized and the land rebounded, this unstable clay remained buried, waiting. The Southview Heights complex is built directly on top of it. Roughly 30 meters beneath the foundations of these multi-million-dollar homes, that clay layer tilts aggressively toward the Pacific. For millennia, everything above it has been sliding, a geological process moving microns at a time, indifferent to human presence. But we accelerated it. The modern ticking clock began in 1968. The province of British Columbia was expanding the coastal highway to service nascent luxury developments. Against engineering warnings, they deposited thousands of tons of heavy fill dirt across the headscarp of this ancient, dormant slide, fatally altering the natural drainage. By October 1969, the ground gave way, destroying dozens of early luxury builds. The homeowners sued the province and won, but the lessons were forgotten, and new subdivisions, heavier and more complex, were built on the same failure plane. Septic tanks, thousands of pools, and extensive landscape irrigation began pumping millions of liters of water into the subsurface clay annually, transforming a stable slope into a time bomb. Then, the climatic variable changed, and the clock began to count down much faster. In early 2023, a series of relentless atmospheric rivers, which Environment and Climate Change Canada classified as once-in-a-century events, battered the coast. This was not normal rainfall. The catastrophic volume did not just run off. It saturated the soil and percolated through bedrock fractures, reaching that critical seashell shear zone 30 meters down. The water acted as a high-pressure lubricant, and the entire mountainside began to detach. At 4:18 a.m. on February 12, 2024, the network of GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite System, stations, monitored in real time by Natural Resources Canada as part of the Canadian Geodetic Survey, detected an unprecedented anomaly. A geophysicist with the Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, noted, "The station SVH3, located in the absolute heart of the development, registered a horizontal shift of 14 centimeters in a single week. This wasn't a slow creep, this was a jump. The pore pressure in the shear zone had hit a critical threshold, effectively eliminating all friction. The ground underneath these structures isn't just sliding, it has liquefacted." This single event rewrote the timeline. The GSC's monitoring network confirmed a terrifying acceleration. By July 2024, what was moving at millimeters per year was now moving at centimeters per week. In some specific sectors of the slide, the rate hit an unthinkable 30 centimeters a week, over a foot of movement in 7 days. What had been a manageable 120-hectare slide complex in 2022 had now doubled to 280 hectares, nearly 700 acres, as the active zone aggressively expanded, swallowing neighborhoods that were previously considered safe. Gravity is now an unrelenting force, shearing apart entire city blocks. The gravity-fed sewer lines snapped first, leaking more water into the slide plane in a lethal feedback loop. The Fortis BC natural gas infrastructure, the sole source of heat and energy for these coastal estates, began to moan under the tension. By August 2024, GSC scientists warned provincial authorities that the slope had crossed an irreversible threshold. The critical infrastructure supporting Southview Heights was no longer tenable. This is the moment the coupled systems of human engineering, geological stability, and climate convergence hit their catastrophic inflection point. To understand the inevitability of the Southview Heights collapse, we have to look at the violent history of the Canadian Cordillera. This is a landscape defined by instability. In 1965, the Hope Slide saw 47 million cubic meters of rock pulverize a valley in seconds, a reminder that the mountains of British Columbia are in a constant state of structural failure. But what is happening on the Sunshine Coast is different. It is a slow-motion version of the 1971 Saint-Jean-Vianney disaster in Quebec, where quick clay, a glacial-marine sediment that looks solid but behaves like a liquid when disturbed, swallowed an entire neighborhood. In Southview Heights, the Geological Survey of Canada has identified a similar mechanism. The underlying seashell shear zone is composed of sensitive silts that have been saturated by 3 consecutive years of record-breaking Pacific moisture. When the salt that binds these clay particles together is leached out by freshwater infiltration, the soil's factor of safety drops below 1.0. At that point, the ground is no longer a solid, it is a suspension. Geophysicists at the University of British Columbia have pointed to a terrifying coupling of systems. It isn't just the rain. We are currently in a period of heightened crustal deformation along the Cascadia subduction zone. While the big one hasn't hit yet, the tectonic loading of the North American plate creates subtle, deep-seated vibrations that scientists call episodic tremor and sleep. These tremors, though barely felt by residents, act like a vibrating table under a house of cards. When you combine tectonic stress with the hydraulic jacking of groundwater, the result is the acceleration we are seeing now. Natural Resources Canada's latest report, Open File 9244, states that the pore water pressure at 30 meters depth has reached levels where the overburden, the hundreds of luxury homes above, is literally being floated toward the sea. The statistics are staggering. According to a collaborative study by the GSC and Environment and Climate Change Canada, 72% of British Columbia's 25,000-kilometer coastline is classified as actively eroding or geologically unstable. This isn't just a Southview problem. It is a national crisis in waiting. In the community of Prince Rupert, rail hubs critical to Canada's Indo-Pacific trade corridor are built on similar glacial-marine deposits. In Newfoundland, the cliffs of the Avalon Peninsula are retreating at a rate of 1 meter per year. Across the country, more than 500,000 Canadians live within high-risk coastal erosion zones. The projected loss in real estate value over the next century exceeds 100 billion Canadian dollars. But the most disturbing revelation from the GSC's 2026 monitoring cycle is the expansionary feedback loop. Initially, the Southview slide was contained to a 120-hectare bowl. However, as the center of the slide moves, it removes the lateral toe support for the adjacent neighborhoods. Imagine removing the bottom book from a leaning stack. By January 2026, the slide boundaries had jumped north and south, effectively tripling the danger zone. This is why the Greater Southview Slide Complex now covers nearly 2% of the entire regional district's landmass. There is a historical parallel that the developers ignored. In 1999, during the construction of a high-end golf resort further up the coast, the 18th hole simply vanished overnight into the Pacific. The developers went bankrupt, and the land was eventually bought for pennies on the dollar by an investment group that rebranded it and sold it to unsuspecting retirees. They built on a scar. Geologists have confirmed that the current 2026 acceleration is following the exact path of a prehistoric failure that occurred 10,000 years ago. We didn't build a neighborhood, we built a weight on a pre-existing fracture. The science tells us that for every 1 millimeter of sea level rise, the rate of cliff retreat can increase by up to 10%. With the Salish Sea rising and the atmospheric rivers becoming more frequent, the standard erosion models have been tossed out. We are entering an era of catastrophic retreat. Public Safety Canada's refusal to fund the $38 million recovery isn't just a budget decision. It's a terrifying admission of policy. By labeling this a pre-existing condition, the federal government is signaling that it will not bail out the Canadian coastline. If the ground was moving before you bought the house, you are on your own. As of March 2026, the GSC confirms that the slide has entered a continuous creep phase, meaning it will not stop until it reaches a new equilibrium, which in this case is the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The human cost of this geological acceleration is measured in the silence of 245 darkened homes. In August 2025, BC Hydro officials arrived at the gates of the Southview Heights estates, not with repair crews, but with disconnection notices. The ground was moving so violently that the overhead lines were snapping like piano wires, and the transformers were tilting at 15-degree angles, sparking fires in the dry coastal brush. Residents were given exactly 24 hours to evacuate or find a way to survive without electricity. This followed 21 months of living without natural gas, after FortisBC declared the entire 700-acre zone a no-service area to prevent a catastrophic pipeline rupture. For families like Sarah McClellan's, who has lived on the point for 42 years, the dream of a coastal retirement has become a survivalist nightmare. Sarah now cooks her meals on a portable propane stove and drives 20 kilometers to the Sechelt Aquatic Center just to take a hot shower. We are refugees in our own living rooms, she says. Her 2.8 million Canadian dollars home is currently sitting on a series of hydraulic jacks and massive steel I-beams, an experimental effort to keep the structure level as the earth slides toward the Salish Sea at 10 centimeters a week. The logistical collapse is total. The main artery connecting these communities to the rest of the Sunshine Coast, a critical stretch of highway, has been rebuilt 4 times in 18 months. Each time the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, MOTI, pours fresh asphalt, only for the Sechelt shear zone to tear it open again within days. Liam Desjardins, a senior geotechnical engineer with MOTI, describes the scene as structural triage. He notes, "We are fighting a war against a force that doesn't tire. Every morning the road has shifted another 2 centimeters west. We have reached the limit of what engineering can patch. This isn't a road anymore. It's a moving bridge with no supports." This infrastructure failure has isolated hundreds of residents, making emergency response nearly impossible. If a medical emergency occurs during a heavy rain event, BC Emergency Health Services may not be able to reach the homes. The ground is simply too unstable for heavy ambulances. Then there is the tension relief strategy, a desperate, world-first experiment by BC Hydro. They are attempting to build a flexible power grid, installing poles on sled-like foundations and using slack-looped wiring designed to stretch and bend as the land moves. It is a high-stakes gamble with no precedent in Canadian history. If it fails, the entire South Hugh Heights Peninsula will be permanently off the grid, rendering hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate functionally uninhabitable. The financial wreckage is equally staggering. In early 2026, the provincial government launched a voluntary buyout program funded by a 42 million Canadian dollar grant from the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. But there is a catch that has left many residents in an economic abyss. The offer is capped at 75% of the home's appraised value from December 2022, before the atmospheric rivers triggered the mass acceleration. For a homeowner like Sarah, whose property was once worth $3 million, the buyout represents a loss of nearly $750,000, not including the hundreds of thousands already spent on structural stabilization. For those with outstanding mortgages, the 75% payout might not even cover what they owe the bank. They are being asked to pay for the privilege of losing their homes. The ecological fallout is the final, silent layer of this disaster. As 700 acres of soil, treated wood, septic chemicals, and household debris slide into the Pacific, the impact on the local marine ecosystem is catastrophic. Dr. Anika Sharma, a marine biologist monitoring the site, reports that the constant influx of sediment has murdered vital eelgrass beds and salmon spawning routes near the base of the cliffs. "We are seeing a localized extinction event in the intertidal zone," she explains. "The sheer volume of silt being dumped by the slide is choking the life out of the coastline." As of April 2026, the Greater South Hughes Light Complex is no longer just a local landslide. It is a systemic failure of Canadian coastal policy, a 500 million Canadian dollar loss of tax base, and a terrifying preview of what happens when the ground we call solid decides to return to the sea. The tragedy unfolding in South Hugh Heights is not a closed chapter. It is the prologue to a new unstable era for the Canadian coastline. As we look toward the winter of 2026 and into 2027, the data provided by Natural Resources Canada suggests that the acceleration we are witnessing is merely the first phase of a larger regional adjustment. The Geological Survey of Canada has recently updated its hazard maps for the Sunshine Coast, and the results are sobering. The Greater South Hughes Light Complex which has already expanded from 120 to 280 hectares, shows no signs of stabilizing. In fact, a 7.1% reacceleration was recorded in the first weeks of the 2026 rainy season, pushing the movement back to nearly 11 centimeters per week. Geologists confirm that as the leading edge of the slide, the toe, is eroded by the high-energy waves of the Salish Sea, the internal pressure of the entire mountainside increases. It is a self-perpetuating engine of destruction. What happens next depends entirely on the saturation levels of the Sechelt shear zone. If the 2027 season brings another series of atmospheric rivers, the slide will likely breach the current emergency perimeter, pushing further into neighborhoods that are currently considered low risk. This is the spreading contagion of geological instability. It isn't just a matter of houses sliding, it is the permanent loss of the land itself. The BC Ministry of Transportation is already drafting contingency plans for a total abandonment of the coastal road, contemplating a multi-billion-dollar tunnel project or a massive inland bypass that would take a decade to complete. In the meantime, the communities to the north remain tethered to the rest of the province by a single crumbling thread of asphalt. But the implications of Southview Heights extend far beyond the borders of British Columbia. The federal government's refusal to provide disaster relief, citing the pre-existing condition of the landslide, has set a chilling precedent for every coastal province. From the eroding sandstone cliffs of Prince Edward Island to the thawing permafrost coastlines of the Northwest Territories, the message from Ottawa is clear. If the geology was known to be unstable before you built, the federal government will not be your insurer of last resort. This creates a massive, unaddressed protection gap in the Canadian economy. We are currently looking at over 100 billion Canadian dollars in property value that is effectively uninsurable against the very real, very imminent threat of the earth moving. In the absence of federal aid or private insurance, the only remaining policy is managed retreat, the deliberate movement of people and infrastructure away from vulnerable areas. But Canada has no national framework for this. The 75% buyout program currently offered in Southview is a desperate, ad hoc experiment. It is a program of unmanaged retreat, where the most vulnerable are left to absorb life-altering financial losses while the ground literally disappears. For the families still holding on in the dark, using propane heaters and hauling water, the choice is between a catastrophic financial loss now or total structural collapse later. Some, like the 80-year-old residents who have known these cliffs for half a century, are choosing to stay until the very end, betting that they can outlast the mountain. The tension relief strategy implemented by BC Hydro remains a fragile bridge to a future that may not exist. While the flexible power lines might sway with the Earth's movement today, they cannot withstand a localized slope failure or a sudden surge event. There is no engineering solution for a continent that is deciding to change its shape. The math of the next decade is inescapable. Sea levels are rising, the shear zones are lubricating, and the frequency of extreme precipitation events is increasing. The coupled systems of our environment have reached a tipping point where the slow processes of geology have become fast events of human catastrophe. As the sun sets over the Salish Sea in late 2026, the sensors scattered across Southview Heights continue to pulse, sending a steady stream of data to laboratories in Ottawa and Vancouver. Each pulse confirms the same relentless truth. The land is moving. The 280 hectares sliding today will likely be 350 hectares by next spring. The fences will continue to tear. The swimming pools will continue to crack. And the multi-million-dollar views will eventually be reclaimed by the water. The question is no longer if the coast will collapse, but how much of Canada we are prepared to lose before we stop building on the edge. Tonight, on the Sunshine Coast, the sensors are still humming, the clay is still wet, and the Pacific is still waiting.